So for like MDMA for PTSD, they recall the trauma and actually re-experience it. Is that what ayahuasca is? Are they actually like reliving the experience, do they say? Or?
Yeah, a lot of the details of that didn't really come up in just, my own experience of it, and then talking to people that have done it. It's like it manifests in some other way, but it's not like the shaman's sitting there coaching them through that memory. It's like them just trying to process it with whatever the ayahuasca experience is giving them to navigate that, and hopefully the songs and the other things in the ceremony are helping them move through it. But with MDMA, there's two therapists, at least with the MAPS protocol, they have two therapists that are sitting there trying to get them to go inward and process it and try and recontextualize that triggered memory. And then they do follow-up integrations sessions afterwards to really kind of get that processed. And then they do a couple of those until the symptoms are extinguished to the best.
So the ayahuasca is just much more free association.
Yeah.
What comes, rather than the kind of practice.
I think so. Because the ayahuasca ceremonies, like in the traditional sense, are not designed for this.
Well, that's where I
the
was.
shaman's not a psychotherapist.
That's where I was a little bit curious, going, okay, we have the subject group is PTSD, and they're using it, but it's not really necessarily designed to be therapeutic. It sounds almost like the therapeutic aspects are accidental.
Well,
That's not a good word it's not the word I'm looking for, but.
The therapy is not the word you're looking for?
Yeah, maybe.
Well, it's like, so it's like this spiritual experience that for some reason is cathartic and helpful, and I don't know that we fully understand why, whether it is kind of this releasing control of the default mode network that's allowing these repressed memories to come to the surface and actually be processed, and that feels like a mystical experience, and then that's what's therapeutic. I don't know, yeah.
Okay.
But I think in the traditional context of how this is implemented in the culture down there is, it's used for like spiritual emergencies. They think of mental illness very differently in the Amazon. It's not really a thing. It's more like, it's a spiritual, they call it a spiritual emergency rather than a psychological thing. So it's just them kind of like what I've heard shamans say is that they'll be able to see like a demon or something in their body, and then they design their Icaros in such a way until they can see it move, and then that's what helps kind of get the juices flowing, and maybe that's that process of things bubbling up to the surface, and somehow they can see that, and they design the smudging that they do, or whatever the practices they use to get at that. If there is a true spiritual component to it that us gringos where we don't take seriously, at least not in like the modern medical model. It's like, no, that's not a real thing. But maybe it is, and we just don't have the capacity or the ability to understand it for what it is, and so we just pathologize it.
Yeah, I find that's a concept that I find very interesting. Very cool.
Yep.
I just would like maybe to hear, do you feel sort of responsible for creating this wave of tourism? Into the, you're doing some messaging, you got in public outlets, and then now you've done this other research, it's like, well, you had that personal experience, it was like, wow, this looks like it's helping people who have symptoms of PTSD and treating them, but now you have all this data that's like, oh, actually, if you have PTSD, you probably shouldn't do ayahuasca. And so is this now is it like corrective?
A little bit. I think it still can work. It's just it's set in setting. It's like, how severe is the PTSD? Do they have a good support system in place if they're going to do it? Really, I just think more thoughtful care preparation needs to go into it if they want to try this. And again, if they're really, really severe, maybe an MDMA session first would be better. But yeah, I was starting to feel uncomfortable about the blossoming of this as it was unfolding and seeing the harms that were being done. So that's why I designed the survey, was like, is this real? Is this, or is it just anecdote? So I think it's a little bit of both. Like, there is some concern. There are some dangers and risks that people need to be aware of, but for the most part, it's a positive experience for people. So, but just kind of, I think with anything, it's just having, it's harm reduction. It's trying to identify, like, this isn't a magic bullet, it's not appropriate for everybody, and trying to figure out what are the things that are the points where it could be dangerous and it could be re-traumatizing for somebody, it could add more controversy to this movement, and it could totally squash people's efforts to bring this into modern medicine. I think it's just good to understand. I mean, that's like what clinical trials are for, to try and figure out where are the spots, who are the people that this isn't appropriate for, what's the dose that's too high, or what's the situation where this isn't going to work. And so with ayahuasca for PTSD, there's just nobody else, there's nobody researching it. There's a lot of people saying it works, but there was just no evidence for it in the sense that, doctors would believe.
You talked a little bit about the more or less like colonial aspect, happening cultural appropriation by United States in the Amazon. But,
Well, it's interesting because the people down there say they have mixed feelings about it. Some of them are excited that the younger generation is becoming more interested in this kind of ancient tradition that they have, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have cared to get involved. But then there's also them that they don't like all these gringos coming down and starting their own retreat centers and being the shamans, that's not going over very well. So I think it's kind of a combination of both. If it's approached responsibly, and humbly, and okay, go to consume rather than take over, participate rather than trying to appropriate.
So also just the demand for the mushroom.
Yeah. Well, that's why I mentioned those centers that are being sustainable about it and growing their own. What's the actual impact? Because as this scales up in our greedy Western demand for things, it's caused problems down there.
Yeah.
They're, tearing down parts of the rainforest, and they're building retreat centers, and but it's bringing in a lot of money to the country. So again, there's mixed feelings about it. Some people are great, a new opportunity for work and money, and those people are, I think for the most part, harmless. They're just trying to make a buck. But then you have the ones that are really kind of exploitative and want to take advantage of people. Okay, we'll go red shirt and then.
I was just going to say, why ayahuasca and not mushrooms?
Why?
Mushrooms are native to America.
Yeah.
They're doing it in Denver.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely an option. At the time, I was inspired by ayahuasca because I had a personal experience with it.
But you said you worked with Dennis McKenna?
I know him, but
Well,
he wasn't.
I know he went to ayahuasca, but he was heavy in mushrooms at the beginning.
Mhm.
Is there something more from ayahuasca than there is from mushrooms, or is there just?
Well, I
it
mean,
just happened to be
ayahuasca's in
you don't have to go, if it just happened to be ayahuasca and that was it,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had a personal interest in ayahuasca at the time that I started this. I'm moving now, having been extremely unsuccessful in trying to get ayahuasca research
That's
going.
kinda where I'm
And so
going.
now I'm shifting to psilocybin research
Yeah.
because it's easier. But ayahuasca is, they call it a master plant. It just takes you
Well,
so
yeah,
much
the
deeper
mind and the
than
soul.
psilocybin.
Yeah.
And to be clear, ayahuasca isn't a plant.
Right.
It's a mixture of, and it can be lots of different plants. So I think you meant the Banisteriopsis copy, but it doesn't have to be that vine. It can be another plant that has an harmony. So it can be a mixture of a lot of different plants, and they don't all grow only in the Amazon. Some of them can grow in the United States in certain parts.
I think some have grown in Hawaii.
Yeah, well, Terrence and Dana actually bought a bunch of land in Hawaii and took a bunch of plants from the Amazon and started a sanctuary there. It's called the Botanical Dimensions, and I think it's owned by Kathleen Harrison now, who's Terrence McKenna's ex-wife. Hold on.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question already, but I was wondering if there's evidence to show the benefits of microdosing LSD and psilocybin. Just wondering if there's kind of the idea of ayahuasca as well as microdose versus a huge trip or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the science on microdosing is almost non-existent. Nobody's really done a good study on microdosing. Again, it's all anecdotal. And I don't really hear of anyone microdosing with ayahuasca. They can. I mean, there was some guy I know, he had a homeopathic jar of it, where it was they basically took the rinsed water from making ayahuasca, and he took that with them, so it had trace amounts, but I don't know if that's doing anything. I think until there's a randomized double-blind trial with microdosing, it's like a placebo effect. People are like, yes, this is awesome, because they've heard it's awesome. So it's really hard to tease out if that's true without a proper study. All right.
what are your thoughts on, say, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder in general and with ayahuasca specifically?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So with that one, I think it only comes up if people are doing a lot of LSD, like it happens if people are doing like more than 100 times of LSD, they'll have this experience. I don't know a whole lot about it though, and I haven't heard it reported a lot in terms of ayahuasca. Rather, there's more like people are having maybe like a transient psychosis after ayahuasca for maybe a month that subsides, but that would probably either indicate that they have some predisposition or not, but like it hasn't been something that's popped up a lot. There was one study that was published about psychosis in ayahuasca, but again, I think those people had a predisposition.
So I saw the data about like anti-anxiety, antidepressants, SSRIs. What did the qualitative data say about those types of experiences? Was it in the data that said, some of the dangerous experiences were not following the preparation and the medicines that they weren't supposed to be on? What were some of the open responses?
Well, I think some people just touched on that, like, oh, I didn't wean off my medication correctly, or I didn't want to stop taking my meds, and then they felt like that made the situation worse, but then they wouldn't have known either way, because they didn't try it without doing that, so it could have just been, it was challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some risks with certain drugs.
So what kind of experience did they have? Do you
Oh, I
recall?
don't know off the top of my head.
I have two questions. So would you mind going back to the table that talks about, I think the dangerous and like a list of all the experiences? Did you ever look at this table for the people that didn't have their experience at a retreat center?
I haven't blocked it by that, no.
Okay, yeah, that would be really interesting to see kind of what falls out of this, because it seems like a lot of this is like centered around the experience that would be had at the retreat center.
Yeah, I'm actively seeking, undergrads and other research help, that would want to dig into this. We've kind of abandoned this.
Yeah.
Like the study, the survey's still open, there's data still coming in, but like I just don't have the bandwidth to work with it anymore.
Sure.
Especially because there's a lot of limitations in what I can do with the data, because there's just certain questions I didn't ask. So I'm really trying to dig in more into the text.
Yeah.
And I just kind of want an undergrad to do something like that.
Yeah, and then my second question is kind of just want your thoughts on it. So I guess, do you have concerns about like entheogens or LSD becoming commodified and taken over by big pharma? And like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's kind of already happening. So Compass Pathways is a pharmaceutical company in Europe, and they're trying to patent psilocybin. It's like a pharmaceutical grade. So, the psilocybin that's being used in all the clinical research right now is a synthetic version of psilocybin. So it's just a pill that they're taking. And so you can patent that process of kind of making a pharmaceutical grade version of it. So that doesn't mean that psilocybin would be, under the patent of this company. It just means that specific form of extraction and synthesis would be patented. And so, like, they did this with Epidiolex, which is CBD, basically. It's being sold for like $32,000 a prescription to treat this like severe form of epilepsy in kids. And it's like they could just grow pot and take the CBD out. It's like really easy. So that is happening, but there are people kind of moving forward. That's why there's a lot of effort to decriminalize these things and let people just grow their own, because that's how, nature provides these things. We don't need a pharmaceutical company to give us a nice little pill, so.
And going off of that, in the slide that you had where it shows people's experience, like the medications they were taking before and after, and how you could see the pretty drastic decrease in like antidepressants and anxieties, and how it's like, okay, well, if this is going to become decriminalized and people can use psychedelic experiences to help alleviate their symptoms, then big pharma isn't going to be pressing these pills and they're not going to make this money. So I think a lot about that.
Yeah, I don't know, I teeter between not wanting to get into like, oh, big pharma is going to try and take down all of our efforts because they want to keep making money. I would like to think that most people want all of us to be well, and whatever.
I know my heart
Yeah.
wants to be there too, but then I see what like Gilead is doing with Truvada, and it's just.
Gilead, what's that? When you say that, I'm thinking of The Handmaid's Tale. That's the name of the country.
That is Gilead.
Yeah, yeah.
Pharmaceutical company?
I mean, it's something I think as people working in this space and trying to advocate for this need to just be aware of and try to steer our efforts. Like, I would love for the research I do here, like I would love to have, instead of having to buy it from USONA, which is, or actually they just give it to me, but it's still a pharmaceutical grade version of it. They don't charge for it. But I would rather just have a grow room on campus, you know, and just have my own supply.
So do you have to purchase for them because it's GMP?
Mhm. Well, and it's like, you know, they've already got, it's just easier to get the IND from the FDA to use it. I think if it's something you're growing, they're like, well, how do we know that you have that exact concentration of the active ingredient and blah, blah. It's like, it's hard with plant-based medicines for the FDA to work with it. They do have a botanical division, but it's tricky to, I mean, I need to like work with some chemists to, you know, test everything on HPLC and make sure we're standardizing doses. And like, if you're growing mushrooms, ultimately you gotta figure out how much psilocybin are they getting. So that's what makes the kind of pharmaceutical grade version more attractive, because especially for research, you can tightly control the dose. Okay.
I was just gonna kind of piggyback off what she said, and I don't want to move the diatribe, but in big pharma, there's a history of like, there's that kind of deceptive research around neuroleptics, denial of feeding, and then neuroleptic patents expire, extolling the virtues of the atypicals, and this would be a natural place to go if atypical patents expire. They're reaching that virtue of that word, rather than passing them. So he would be neglected of that. Very cool.
And I think with patents, they last like 20 years and you just have to find a new application and everything, so.
Would you say ayahuasca is your number one treatment for PTSD? You think it's the best?
No, I think MDMA is the best.
MDMA?
Well, it's the one that's got the most evidence, and it's probably gonna be approved by 2 years. If phase 3 looks like phase 2.
Is that easier as well?
Well, I mean, easier in terms of an experience.
Well, the process going through.
I mean, it's the same. I mean, trying to get anything approved through clinical trial is.
No, using MDMA
It's
versus
easier.
ayahuasca.
Oh, definitely. I mean,
Of course, yeah.
it's a much more pleasant experience. I mean, people with PTSD still find it very triggering, and it maybe doesn't have that same euphoric feeling that normal people would have. There's like an anxiety component to it because it is also kind of activating them and increasing their heart rate. But because it's sort of having maybe more of a response on the amygdala, it's reducing that fear reaction that they might have as their experience is coming up and their memories are coming up. So I just feel like it's a gentler way for them to deal with that. And I mean, the success rate in the clinical trials is so impressive. So,
Just for the PTSD
yeah.
purpose, right?
I mean, it helps build trust. Like, there's this therapeutic alliance, you know, and the rapport with the therapist, and just, I mean, part of the mechanism of action of MDMA is it also releases things like oxytocin, which are, you know, like when you hug people, it's like the bonding hormone, so it just helps you feel more trust with the therapist, and so I feel like they're able to go deeper with the therapist because they have that trust, whereas with ayahuasca, there was a lot of issues that came up about not trusting people, and I think that's a really important aspect of working with the therapist.
I don't know, maybe this is too personal. Would you care to share your experience when you went to the jungle?
Yeah. Well, the first time I did it, I was very arrogant. I had been doing a lot of mushrooms at the time, and so I figured I can navigate my mind. I know how to deal with these altered states of consciousness, and I was very arrogant. So I went down there and I was like, show me everything. I want to know everything. And the experience was very disorienting and terrifying, and just like the more I tried to understand it and process it, the more confusing it got. And I didn't have the shaman there with me. He was up in his tent up somewhere else, and all of us were kind of left to our own devices. And so thankfully I had done San Pedro 2 days before, and I had recorded a bunch of stuff of like insights I had had, and so because I didn't have any Icaros, I didn't have a shaman singing to me, I didn't have any of that stuff, I had to use my own recording and my own voice as my own guide to get me back. And then that was kind of like a nice harsh lesson of like, okay, don't try and force the experience to be what you think it is. And like surrender is just a big aspect of it being a pleasant experience. So then the next time I did it, I just kind of said, all right, I trust you, do your thing. And I just didn't really have any intention other than heal whatever you got to heal. And then it was a very beautiful experience. I felt like that scene in Avatar when they're tapping each of the underground network of light and nodes, and I felt like a node of light in the network of the jungle, and I felt physically connected to all the plants, and it just felt good. It felt like, I mean, for people that have had these kind of mystical psychedelic experiences and this feeling of oneness, kind of merging with the universe, and like got a bit of that. There's something very pleasant about that sensation. Just feeling so connected to everything.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments?
I have one more question. Would you mind going back to the like network where it has like the HPA and like the inhibitions and excitations? I was just wondering, so you have like the HPA and that gets you activated, and then it releases adrenaline and activates the hippocampus, which is like where your memories are. And like, because when you have PTSD, if that's constantly activated, do you find that people with PTSD have not necessarily like less fidelity in terms of like understanding their experience, but even like rating like social support and things like that if they're constantly in an activated state?
I mean, they have pretty substantial cognitive deficits.
Yeah. So do you think it would be beneficial to have them take some type of like personality inventory before and after to kind of like assess the way that they perceive themselves in relation to the world after taking like ayahuasca or something like that?
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I mean, I think it would be good to find some metric that can assess that domain of whatever that dysfunction is. So some cognitive measure or some learning task.
Yeah.
Because another thing that ayahuasca does that we're finding out is it produces or it promotes neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So we know this in animal models, and presumably that's what's happening in humans. And so if there's this atrophy happening in the hippocampus and ayahuasca is able to restore that, that might help. So, I mean, I just don't know that any of the studies looking at, like, this is something I wanted MAPS to do. I was asking them about this when I was reading the literature on kind of this hippocampal atrophy and PTSD, and that are they, because they're not imaging them before and after or doing any of these cognitive tasks in real detail to see if there's actually increases in this. They're kind of mostly looking at symptoms, like PTSD symptoms, but I think it would be interesting if there was a neuroimaging component that, you know, they could actually restore volume in the hippocampus if that's actually what's happening.
Is ayahuasca the only one that's producing that neurogenesis?
Nope.
Because I know ketamine does the...
Yeah, so
but it just wasn't sure if there's anything else.
yeah, they're trying to rebrand some of these things as psychoplastogens because they induce rapid functional and structural and functional plasticity, meaning that it's changing the actual circuitry in the brain, and then it's also promoting some sort of behavioral change or functional change that they can measure. And so nobody's really doing this in humans to see if we can actually harness that. I'm actually trying to plan a study to see if we can capture the afterglow and see if we can get people to learn things better.
Okay.
But that's going to be in healthy people. So, yeah, in the back.
Do you go to the growth slide? I had a question about that.
The growth slide.
Where it was like the post-traumatic growth, 3-bar.
Yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure how to interpret that.
So this is like so say this is, I mean, this was designed, so thinking about your trauma, do you feel that you're more able to relate to others after that experience? Do you feel like you're more open to new possibilities after that experience? So I had them ask that in the context of ayahuasca to see if they could have a positive reaction to the experience rather than because there is this hypothesis out there that for someone with PTSD, it could be re-traumatizing. So is this a trauma for them, and how are they responding to that?
So let me correct like how I'm thinking. So like the current PTSD people then are they're saying that they experience less. They're endorsing experiencing less growth than the others.
Yeah. Like they basically aren't finding their ayahuasca experience to promote this kind of
Growth
wellness.
promoting.
Yeah. For them.
Okay, so even people without PTSD would still say endorse that they experience growth.
Yeah.
from it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because like behaviorally you saw clear changes. Like that's for me was most like compelling data. Like they just like after the experience less medication, less therapy, whatever. But yet they aren't endorsing growth. I don't really know.
I wonder if this gets at what you were
What to
talking
make
about.
that
Like
or-
maybe they just can't perceive it. They just can't see it as that
Yeah.
because they're just their mind can't go there right now.
Behaviorally they were doing it.
Yeah. But then in their trip reports, they're like, but this was so amazing and I feel
Mhm.
wonderful. So
And they're endorsing they're agreeing with the positive qualities of the experience.
right.
How long was this done after their experience?
It varied. Some people it was like the very next week or the next day. Some people it had been 15 years. So
Another thing I'm curious, the physical purging from ayahuasca. Is there any reason or explanation or actual practical study on that? The effect?
physiologically, I don't know, other than certain aspects of it are purgative, so they just kind of naturally induce that. But experientially, it's
Mhm.
like it accompanies you actually like letting go of something major, like you're vomiting
Pushing out
all the
negative.
evil that's ever been in your life, and that's what it feels like as it's happening. So there's it's really important to the catharsis that people need to have to let go of whatever they're struggling with, and it's just like an actual.
Yeah, but
They can actually let it go.
is it induced by the plant?
Yeah. I can tell you after I drank it, like within 10 minutes, I was like, oh God, like,
So it literally makes you want to vomit.
yeah. It
Not
tastes
everybody
bad.
does though.
Yeah, not everybody vomits, but it's a pretty common reaction.
Mhm.
And it's just like as soon as it hits your stomach, it just starts churning,
Hmm.
So, I don't know. But I think that's what the tobacco purges are trying to do, that they'll give people beforehand, is they want to get you cleansed so that you don't purge. But I feel like, I don't know, if you're really struggling with something, it's very helpful to be able to have that release.
Mhm.
People purge in different ways. It could be crying, it could be screaming, it could be running, But for that one, it's just very consistent. So I would imagine there is something that maybe just interacts with some demon in your body or something, I don't know.
Yeah, so I had a question. You said that in the Amazon they treat psychosis and mental illness differently. And you said that they treat it like a spiritual problem. So I'm wondering if you know about like reports of using either ayahuasca or other psychedelics to treat psychosis and what the effects of that were.
Not good.
Not good.
They tried it initially back in the 50s. They thought it was a way first to understand it, and then they thought they could treat it. There are like some successful case studies of it. Like there was this catatonic little kid who had just had a really severe form of schizophrenia, and it helped her talk again. But like those are exceptions, like they're not, most of the research that came out of the 50s and 60s trying to look at this in that context found like that's why we say now this isn't appropriate. They learned a lot about the serotonergic system and they learned a lot about psychosis, but it's probably not a good treatment because they're already in this space of having kind of delusional thinking, and so you're just adding on to that. So it's just not a good.
But really
combination.
it's good for like PTSD, anxiety, depression.
Yeah.
What other like disorders, like
Addiction.
What other disorders do you say?
There's, go back to that network. Addiction, depression, end-of-life anxiety, some neurological stuff like cluster headaches and epilepsy, OCD, social anxiety. But I feel like a lot of these, they kind of have overlapping symptoms, so it might be treating the same thing. It's just there's different branches of how it manifests in different people.
MAPS is trying to do MDMA for eating disorders
Mhm.
also.
Yeah. Yeah, there was someone trying to use ayahuasca for that, but it's tricky because somebody who's either anorexic or bulimic and they've already got these issues around purging, and then you ask them to purge. All right, any other questions? I don't want to keep you guys here too late.
I noticed in some of your guys it said like under revision.
Yeah.
Are you planning on releasing it or?
Yeah. So the qualitative stuff is in press, so it's gonna come out in a book, hopefully by the end of this year. And then the other one, I submitted it to Scientific Reports twice, and just, you were bringing up all these limitations, and some of, like, there's just the reviewers, there's some issues of trying to analyze it, because there's certain questions I didn't ask. So, it's been a year since they sent me that second set of things of wanting to send it back in, and I just have not done it. Because I think there's just some limitations with the data, and there's certain things I can't conclude with the information that I have. So I'm either just gonna try and reframe it within the context of what it can say, or scratch that and focus on the qualitative stuff moving forward, or redesign it and start over.
Thank you.
Okay, cool, thank you.